My name is Teresa Walters. This is my Extreme Makeover for NU 713, Organizational and Systems Leadership for the Advanced Practice Nurse. Jacksonville State University, spring of 2022. The purpose of this presentation is to identify a time when a miscommunication occurred in my workplace, the retelling of the story of the miscommunication, as well as identifying factors that influence the miscommunication and concepts that can change the culture of my organization. This presentation will also discuss how conversation influences a culture of an organization. Concepts of communication that will be discussed are patterns of relating, patterns of meaning and making meaning, ways of talking, listening and mindfulness, and innovation. The goal for my organization is to change from one of frustration to one of innovation by utilizing the concepts introduced in this presentation. The story of miscommunication in my workplace is as follows. I am an ICU nurse who works night shift. The story revolves around a patient who arrived shortly after shift change. The patient arrived to the emergency room at approximately 1500 that same day via family and car with complaints of shortness of breath times 1 week. This patient has a history of COPD as well as multiple hospital admissions of COPD exacerbation. Patient's O2 on arrival was 79%. ABGs were ordered. The results show that PaO2 of 47% and a CO2 of 82%. Patient was placed on BiPAP and pulmonology was consulted. Patient was also ordered to be tested for COVID. While the COVID swab was being performed, the patient was adamant that there was no way she could possibly have COVID, stating that she never leaves her home. The patient has family at her bedside while in the ER that consists of 2 daughters and a granddaughter. At approximately 1900, shift report was called to me in the ICU with an admission diagnosis of COPD exacerbation. ER nurse never mentioned COVID. While patient was transferred to ICU, the patient's family was placed in ICU family waiting room. After patient arrived, I completed the patient's full assessment, her medication reconcilement, and her her history. Secondary follow-up ABGs were also drawn during this time. When I was finished with the patient's complete admission, I checked the patient's lab results to compare her new ABG results to her previous one. At this time is when I noticed that the patient's COVID test results were positive. I asked the patient if she was aware that she was positive for COVID. The patient immediately became upset, stating that no one told her that she had COVID and that there was no way she could have it because she didn't leave her home. At this point, I told her that, that I would verify the results with the ER nurse, but that, even though she doesn't leave her home, she does live with her daughter, her son-in-law, and her granddaughter, and that there was it was possible that she had it, had received it from them. After calling the ER, I spoke with the ER nurse, and the ER nurse stated that the day shift ER nurse was the one who swabbed the patient, so it was her job to check for the results. She was not told that the patient had COVID, and so she didn't know. This means that the patient was in ER without isolation precautions being followed as well. At this time, I alerted my charge nurse that the patient was transported without COVID precautions being followed. I then went to the ICU family waiting room to advise the patient's family that the patient had COVID. Upon walking in, I noticed that the patient's family members were unmasked and in close proximity to other family members of other patients who also were unmasked. At this time, all visitors were made aware of the patient's COVID status and advised that they would now need to all be tested for COVID. The patient's family was given a full update on the patient's status and condition and then sent home instead of being able to visit the patient in ICU. I believe there were 2 major miscommunications that both stem and break down during both shift reports. There was also miscommunication between the nurse and patient and her family. There was also failure to follow through with tests and their results. This being said, there was possibly miscommunication between the lab and the emergency room if the results were never communicated to the ER nurse. Hospital policy states that the lab should call results of positive COVID test in case that the ER nurse does not follow up herself. Variables that affected this miscommunication include staff shortages, as the ER was short-staffed that night, as well as frustration due to the night shift ER nurse having to take over this patient's care just long enough to get through shift change and then to transfer the patient to the ICU instead of the day shift ER nurse calling an accurate report and transferring the patient to ICU herself before she left. Conversation themes in my organization focus on staff shortages and being undervalued. Many staff nurses have left to travel. Half of our unit's nurses are travel nurses who make quite a larger amount more pay for the same workload as staff nurses. To top this off, staff nurses are about to receive a significant pay decrease as we are now losing our additional COVID pay. When asked about the pay decrease, management states we should be happy we had it as long as we have. Afterwards, the questions were dismissed and we were basically ignored. When this is all added together, staff nurses feel unappreciated, unheard, undervalued, and frustrated. This leads to more staff nurses wanting to leave to travel. My organization's current culture is one of frustration. This is due to the constant disregard of staff shortages, which affects patient and staff safety. Undervalued staff are leaving to travel at alarming rates. Not only are changes not being made to retain staff nurses, but the organization is decreasing staff pay. Organizations are formed by patterns of meaning and patterns of relating. Patterns of meaning are an organization's mission and vision. An organization's mission and vision serve as a pattern of meaning that informs the collective organizational identity. Patterns of relating form an organization's culture on how people interact with each other. Patterns of relating are shared ways of thinking, feeling, and behaving. This interacting is gained by talking and listening, not only through face-to-face interactions, but also through email or even texting. Patterns of meaning are an organization's mission and vision. Meaning is a social construction that arises in the gesture-response interactions. Gestures can include emotions, reflections, or explanations. Meaning is created in the response to that gesture. This back and forth is what creates communication. Ways of talking, listening, and mindfulness are essential for relational reading. Our ways of speaking in organizations are patterns that can reinforce and stabilize culture. Over time, the choices we make in daily conversations result in a pattern of speech and habitual ways of talking. Listening includes using gestures that are both verbal and nonverbal, as well as responding to those gestures. It is crucial to listen between the gestures to comprehend the shared understanding. To offer a response, you must be present in the conversation. Mindfulness is described as the energy of being aware and awake in the present moment. This mindfulness is a great attribute that is needed to acquire the potential to contribute to your organization in a positive manner. Innovation is based on the notion that misunderstanding is needed for communication to open up between staff in order for new meaning to be developed. Utilizing both and thinking enables innovation. Both means to acknowledge that multiple perspectives are functional and viable, and relates to the yet to be that emerges from the ongoing conversation. This yet to be can be an idea, process, or a product. To propel my organization as conversation, I will embody my organization's mission and vision and encourage communication between the leaders of my organization and the staff nurses. We need to come together to discuss the issues at hand. By embracing innovation, the organization will have the ability to build and maintain trusting relationships with staff. Patterns of relating changes come from the utilization of a combination of relational leading, responsive relating, and talking and listening patterns of relating. By utilizing patterns of relating, the actions and interactions are woven together to successfully accomplish joint endeavors. Changing the story to one that embraces innovation will include utilizing both and thinking, inspiring innovators, and saying yes to the mess. Innovators dwell in the collaboration and appreciate the potential that emerges in the disarray of not having full control. My extreme makeover is as follows. One night while I was working in the ICU, a patient arrived shortly after shift change. The patient came to the ER at approximately 1500 for shortness of breath times 1 week. Even though the patient has a history of COPD and has an O2 sat of 79%, COVID test was performed. ABGs were also performed. Due to the results of the ABGs, pulmonology was consulted. Even though the patient was adamant that there was no way she had COVID, she was placed on COVID precautions until the results were confirmed. The patient's report was called to me in the ICU. The admission diagnosis given was COVID and COPD exacerbation, patterns of relating, and purposeful listening. Patient's family was informed of COVID results, advised of need to be tested, and sent home prior to transfer, patterns of relating. When patient arrived, the SRN utilized isolation precautions immediately during assessment, including N95 mask, gown, double gloves, and mask, mindfulness, and innovation. Patient states that the ER nurse told her that she was tested, that she was positive for COVID. Since the family was never sent to the ICU family waiting room, other visitors were not exposed. Mindfulness.